Good day. Though some of the drama has gone out of the Ukrainian crisis, with the indications that the Russians have drawn down some of their troops on Ukraine's border, the diplomacy continues at a fairly intense rate. And we now have confirmation that US Secretary of State Antony Blinken will be traveling to Ukraine next week, where he will presumably have discussions with President Zelensky and with other top people within the Ukrainian leadership. Meanwhile, we've had a very strange declaration. I say strange, actually bizarre would be more correct, declaration from the European Parliament threatening Russia with all kinds of sanctions in the event that it commits aggression against Ukraine. And we've also had various demands, or more demands, from Zelensky, becoming increasingly shrill now, for a summit meeting with President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, and a very eccentric proposal from Zelensky that this summit meeting take place not in Moscow, as Putin at one point seemed to suggest, but rather in the Vatican, a proposal which apparently the Vatican itself was unaware of when it was made. It had not been cleared with them, and which Putin, I think, is bound to reject. Indeed, I strongly suspect that the Russians will see this rather odd proposal by Zelensky to hold the summit meeting in the Vatican as proof that this is not a serious proposal for a summit meeting at all. Last but not least, and perhaps of more practical and important significance, there were detailed discussions within the context of the so-called tripartite group to secure the ceasefire in eastern Ukraine. This has not really ever gelled since the Ukrainians started to escalate the situation in eastern Ukraine at the start of the year. There continues to be sporadic shelling across the conflict line. Ukrainian troops still get killed on a periodic basis, apparently by snipers, principally by snipers from the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and from time to time also Ukrainian soldiers have been killed by landmines which it seems they themselves have planted. So these discussions for securing the ceasefire have resumed and taken place. I would add that they also involve the representatives, officials of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. The Ukraine refuses to negotiate or talk with the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics at a political and diplomatic level. It is prepared to sit down and talk with them on questions of the ceasefire on the conflict line. However, those negotiations apparently were deadlocked, despite considerable progress being made on certain technical issues. Allegedly, and I'm taking this information now from the officials of the Donetsk People's Republic, because the Ukrainians refused to go along with the ceasefire proposals because they saw them as, in effect, granting some kind of recognition of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics as belligerents in this conflict, whereas Ukraine, of course, continues to insist that the conflict is entirely between itself and Russia. I suspect that after all this grandstanding by Ukraine takes place, at some point there will be an agreement, probably brokered at an international level through the so-called Normandy IV Format, whereby these proposals for a ceasefire are reconfirmed and Ukraine agrees to abide by them. At that point, the Ukrainians will withdraw their forces from eastern Ukraine, and we will be, in some respects, back to the status quo ante, to the situation which existed before that ceasefire started to unravel at the start of the year and before Ukraine redeployed its forces on this massive scale to the conflict line in March, over the course of March. Well, how can we interpret all of these moves? How do we interpret, in particular, Blinken's decision to travel to Ukraine and to meet with Zelensky and other top Ukrainian officials? Well, I'm going to say this. Of course, there is a view, which I know is popular, that this is all about coordinating positions between the United States and Ukraine with a view to assisting Ukraine in the offensive that many people still believe Ukraine is preparing to launch against the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And those who no doubt think in that way will regard the resolution from the European Parliament threatening Russia with sanctions as further proof that all these moves are being coordinated with each other and that an Ukrainian attack across the conflict line is still on the cards and is still coming. And I'm going to say straight out that I don't know for a fact that that is not the case. There are still people in Ukraine, in my opinion, who would indeed hanker for such an attack. And I am sure that there are people in Washington, and there are undoubtedly some people in London, the hardest line of all the major Western states where Ukrainian issues are concerned, who would probably favor a Ukrainian attack, accepting the prospect of a Russian counterattack, perhaps overestimating Ukraine's ability to withstand that counterattack, and looking forward eagerly to the sanctions on Russia, which they hope to impose and which that resolution by the European Parliament threatens. That resolution, which is, by the way, entirely advisory, it does not bind European governments in any form, would call for Russia to be entirely disconnected from SWIFT and for Nordstrom II to be cancelled. Well, I have to say, I understand this argument, I understand these views, and as I said, I believe this view that this is all preparatory to the launch of an offensive by Ukraine in eastern Ukraine. But though I understand the view, I still think that this is unlikely, and I read the signs differently. I think far more likely Blinken is going to Ukraine, to Kiev, to make sure that that attack that's been much talked about in eastern Ukraine doesn't happen. I suspect he's going to talk Zelensky and the Ukrainians into making concessions on the ceasefire talks in order to get the Ukrainian troops withdrawn from the ceasefire line. And of course, he's going to do all of that whilst covering himself politically and covering the Biden-Harris administration politically by making all kinds of resounding declarations about how the United States supports Ukraine and Ukraine's territorial integrity, but and that its support for Ukraine is unfaltering and unwavering. In other words, I expect strong words in public, a strong show of support for Ukraine in public, and in private, strong advice to the Ukrainians to stand down and not to press their luck too far by launching offensives in eastern Ukraine. I say that because all the indications that are coming out of Washington at the moment suggests that the US is in a conciliatory mood, if I can put it so strongly, towards the Russians, and really does generally seek a de-escalation. Now, I say that because, of course, there have been repeated statements by US officials, starting with President Biden himself, but including Secretary Blinken, including White House spokesman Jen Psaki, all of whom say the same thing, that they will punish Russia when it transgresses, but that they don't want to do that, that they want to stop a downward spiral in relations, that they want to stabilize the situation, and that they want a de-escalation. And in fact, there are cogent reasons why the United States might seek at this time to adopt that policy. It's not been widely commented about, but perhaps the single aspect of the address that President Biden gave to the two houses of Congress, which we are told should not be referred to as a State of the Union address, but the single uniting thread of this whole address was the constant harping on the urgency of the United States to stand up against China. The President Biden, went out of his way to justify his extraordinarily ambitious and, by the way, in the address itself, uncosted proposals for essentially massive economic change in the United States, for a turbocharging of the US economy, for an updating of the US educational system, for an updating of the US infrastructure system, for all of that as part of the need by the United States to strengthen its position with respect to China. It's clear that there are officials within the United States, I suspect also, by the way, within the Pentagon, for whom the challenge from China now weighs heavily and which they want to prioritize over all else. They sense that China has gained ground dangerously on the United States, whilst the United States was distracted after 2001 with its so-called war on terror, which involved the United States in all sorts of ill-starred adventures in the Middle East. And they also feel that the United States became distracted after 2014 in a conflict in Europe with Russia over Ukraine, which was going nowhere and which did not address essential US strategic interests. I suspect that there is here a particular divide within the Pentagon between the Navy, which is overwhelmingly focused on the challenge from China, and the Army, the US Army, which still sees its role essentially as focused on Europe, and which is concerned about the challenge from the Russian army in Europe. I think the Navy, by contrast, wants to refocus US resources to the Pacific. I think it wants to downgrade the challenge with Russia. I think it recognizes that the United States is not in a position where it can take on both the two adversary superpowers, China and Russia, in Europe and Asia at the same time. So I suspect there is this tug within the Pentagon between the two, and I suspect that the Biden administration, the Biden-Harris administration, focused as it overwhelmingly is on US domestic policies, supports those voices within the Pentagon and within the intelligence community who say that some kind of a ceasefire, a geopolitical ceasefire with Russia is essential so that the United States can focus on its priority challenge, which is China. I would remind my viewers that, as I discussed in earlier programs on this channel, some weeks ago, a very strange and rather remarkable study appeared on the Atlantic Council's website, authored by somebody called Anonymous, which discussed at length how grave the challenge from China allegedly is, what a wicked person President Xi Jinping of China also supposedly is, and spoke at length about the importance of the United States de-escalating with Russia, finding some kind of way to reach a modus vivendi with Russia in order to draw Russia away from its current alliance, de facto alliance with China, and so as to release US resources in order to challenge China in the Pacific region. Anonymous, of course, went even further than that. He essentially spoke about breaking the Russian-Chinese alliance so as to distract the Chinese by getting them to refocus their energies on their northern border with Russia and to leave the Pacific alone. In other words, Anonymous basically wants to return to the kind of triangulation policies which were once used with brilliant success by Henry Kissinger in the early 1970s, of playing Russia and China off against each other, leaving the United States as the arbiter in a overwhelmingly strong position. That idea, in my opinion, is a total dead letter. It's not going to happen. But nonetheless, the possibility of some kind of ceasefire, if you like, it's not going to be friendship and it's certainly not going to be peace with Russia, I think is the priority now. And I think that is what the United States, or at least the Biden-Harris administration, is trying to work towards. I think this is what the talk of a summit is all about. And in fact, we are now receiving information that a discussion about a summit is now taking place, that it is serious, that US and Russian officials are in fact talking regularly to each other. The State Department has just confirmed that there are now regular contacts with the Russians and has emphasized how important it is to keep those contacts with the Russians live and ongoing. And I think that the talk of a summit, which is likely to take place in June, is now crystallizing and it is becoming real. Now, Anonymous, in that article on the Atlantic Council, spoke about the United States needing to make concessions to Russia in order to buy Russia's agreement either to this de-escalation or rapprochement in Europe, or perhaps even to get it to be drawn away from its alliance with Russia. And I think that there are some people in the United States, in the administration, in the Pentagon, who probably do desire to see, who do accept the need to make some concessions. And it's probable that those concessions are going to, in some way, involve Ukraine. Now, Putin spoke recently in his address to his parliament about having Russia red lines, and he gave a strong warning that if those red lines were transgressed, Russia would react forcefully. And as I've discussed again in many programs on this channel, those red lines undoubtedly include Ukraine. They undoubtedly include a formal agreement, or at least an agreement of some kind by the United States that Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, all of these countries, Belarus, will not be drawn into NATO or into the EU. And I suspect that is going to be a major topic of discussion at the summit, and is probably a major topic of discussion now. So this is what I suspect Blinken, who seems to be fully a supporter of this policy, I suspect this is what explains his visit to Ukraine at this time. He does not want a conflict in eastern Ukraine, which would turn all this policy of some sort of de-escalation with Russia and a US disengagement from Europe so that he can focus on China. He doesn't want to see that happen at any price, at almost any price. He's going to strongly advise the Ukrainians that an attack in eastern Ukraine is absolutely not something that the United States wants to see. I think he's going to go beyond that. One of the most interesting developments in recent weeks has been that the United States, in its various comments with Ukrainian officials, has increasingly come round to talking about the need for the full implementation of the Minsk Agreement that was agreed by Ukraine and the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic, in February 2015 at a meeting in Minsk, which was brokered by the Germans, the French and the Russians. Now, Ukraine has been extremely unwilling to perform its obligations under the Minsk Agreement. Zelensky has repeatedly talked about the need for that agreement, the Minsk Agreement, to be recalibrated, to be changed in some way. And in fact, he talked about it recently again, and his constant efforts for a summit meeting with Putin seem to be focused very much in that direction. They seem to be part of an attempt by Zelensky to try to get the Russians into a position where they at least appear to be a belligerent party in the conflict, rather than, as the Russians insist, entirely a third party, with the belligerent parties be Ukraine itself and the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, with the conflict being strictly an internal one, and the Ukrainians under an obligation to negotiate directly with the leaders of those two republics in order to settle that issue. The US, when the Minsk Agreement was signed, was very critical of it. That, by the way, was in the final days of the Obama administration. Since then, the United States has shown great wariness of the Minsk Agreement and has tended to be, as by the way Britain has also been, full-throated in its support of Ukraine and in the picture of Ukraine as a country that is not in the grip of what is essentially a civil war, but rather a country which is a victim of Russian aggression. So the US decision over the last few weeks to start to talk about the full implementation of the Minsk Agreement, which implies negotiations between Ukraine and the leaders of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, that looks to me like a major change. And I suspect that is what Zelensky is going to Ukraine to say. He's going to want to make it very clear to the Ukrainians that that is what the United States wants to see. It wants to see Ukraine starting to act in accordance with the commitments it took upon itself in Minsk in February 2015, and it will want to start to see serious negotiations begin to take place between Ukraine and the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, as insisted on by Putin and the Russians. Now, that's not going to be a welcome message in Kiev, to say the least. But the Ukrainians, obviously, are in a very difficult position. Their army is still there on the ceasefire line, unable to advance, unable to retreat, and they must sense that support for them in the West is flagging. They're also undoubtedly made increasingly nervous by the talk of a Biden-Putin summit, and the fact that that summit now looks as if it's becoming a reality. And undoubtedly, too, they are concerned that they're going to be pushed by the US and the Russians, and probably by the Germans and the French also, towards concessions in relation to the negotiations with the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, which they do not want to make. And in my opinion, this is the explanation for the recent resolution that was passed by the European Parliament. The Ukrainians have many friends, as we know, in Eastern Europe, especially in the Baltic states and Poland. And this resolution, which was recently passed by the European Parliament, was sponsored by European MPs from those countries. The essential point about the resolution is that it continues to refer to Russia as the primary aggressor. And I think the idea is that the Ukrainians are trying to find some way of highlighting internationally their narrative and getting it reinforced and accepted that they are the victims of Russian aggression, that they are not the subject of an internal conflict within Ukraine, and that this resolution, which the European Parliament has passed, sponsored by the East European states, by the Poles and the Balts and their MPs in the Parliament, I think that was what that was all about. It was intended to give the Ukrainians some bargaining tool when Blinken comes and visits them next week, bringing with him the news they don't want to hear. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, the reality is that that resolution is purely advisory and is actually meaningless. European governments, who actually are the ones which make the decisions, have shown no interest in the kind of sanctions that the European Parliament was talking about. There seems to be no desire to cut off Russia from SWIFT, probably because there's a great deal of recognition amongst European governments that Russia could now withstand the effect of such a cut-off with only moderate damage, whilst cutting off Russia from SWIFT would deal serious damage to the European economy, with European businesses that have invested in Russia finding it difficult to withdraw money from there. And of course, Nordstrom II, as German officials have been saying clearly over the last few days and weeks, remains for the Europeans and the Germans especially an overwhelming and overriding priority. In fact, Nord Stream 2 is now almost completed, and there was even an article in the Atlantic Council's website, obviously penned by neocons, hostile to Nord Stream 2, expressing some panic that it's almost too late now. It's becoming almost too late now to find some way to stop it. So I think that the reality is, despite this resolution, which the Ukrainians have got their European friends to pass in the European Parliament, the reality is that they are facing Blinken from a very weak position. And I think that we will start to see over the next few weeks some of the consequences of all of this. The Ukrainians will agree to the ceasefire terms that have now been floated. They will be told quite categorically that they have to and that they have no choice. And we will start to see the Ukrainian forces that have been deployed on the contact line, and we will start to see those being withdrawn. I'm going to say something about that, by the way, about those forces, which I had not appreciated until recently, but I've been shown some videos of the troop deployments, the Ukrainian troop deployments, the railway convoys showing the Ukrainian troops heading eastward. And I have to say, the appearance was not impressive. Their materials seemed to be an extraordinary ragbag of old Soviet armoured vehicles left over from the period of the Warsaw Pact, looking rusty and unmodernised, and civilian vehicles as well. The idea that this force could seriously withstand a Russian counteroffensive, which I've always discounted, seems to me completely unrealistic. I would add that I've also since learnt that the heavy weapons that the Russians have left deployed along the contact line after their own withdrawal of troops are overwhelmingly long-range artillery assets, including advanced ballistic missiles. That suggests that if there was a Ukrainian attack, the Ukrainian troops, which would be effectively exposed on the ground, almost certainly without effective air cover, would find themselves facing devastating artillery and missile strikes, probably before facing envelopment by the huge armoured forces that the Russians have shown that they're able to deploy to the Ukrainian border within a matter of days. So I think that the Ukrainians will be told that an advance into the Donbass is absolutely out of the question. They will be forced to agree to the ceasefire proposal, and they will be made to withdraw their troops. Now, it's highly likely that they will continue to resist the pressure which continues to build on them to agree to negotiations with the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. I think Zelensky's position is far too fragile for that to happen. But I think the result of that will be that Ukraine remains trapped in its existing limbo, because I predict that one product of this summit meeting between Biden and Putin in June, which is now looking increasingly likely to happen, is that there will be an implicit agreement that the United States will not seek to include Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, all of these countries into NATO, at least for the period of time that the Biden-Harris administration is in office in Washington. So Ukraine will be left in its existing unsustainable limbo. And given that from a US point of view, its practical utility has gone, because with Nordstrom II completed, with Sevastopol and Crimea lost, and with no prospect, or at least no immediate prospect, of Ukraine being drawn into NATO, at that point, US interest in Ukraine will start to slacken away, and we will see Ukraine gradually and over time left to its own devices. What the Ukrainians will do then remains to be seen. I'm going to finish by making a general observation about this whole conflict. That coup which took place in February 2014, the Maidan event, the event which Ukrainians refer to as the Revolution of Dignity, but which pretty much everyone quietly acknowledges was actually a coup, and which the Russians, of course, openly referred to it as a coup. That was a regime change, or a coup too far. The United States intruded far too deeply into the strategic sphere of another great power, which was Russia. As a result, it found itself in temporary control of a vast belt of territory which is undefendable and where its presence in the long term is unsustainable. The only issue is how the United States withdraws. Does it do so in an orderly way, in a face-saving way, which is what the Biden-Harris administration appears at the moment to be trying to do? Or does it do so in a humiliating way as a result of a war in Ukraine, which will lead to Ukraine's collapse, its reabsorption into Russia, and the humiliation of the United States, and a political crisis in Washington? Well, we shall see. The resistance to a rapprochement with Russia in Europe and to a de-escalation there remains incredibly strong in Washington and in some European capitals. But it looks to me, for the first time since Obama's ill-starred and entirely dishonest reset of 2009 to 2014, as ultimately the process that is now most likely to take place. We shall see whether I am right over the next few weeks and months. Thank you for joining me for this program. I look forward to you joining me in other programs on this channel, and please remember to check out our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also check out our main Alex's channel. You'll find links under this video. Please check us out on our various platforms, other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, and especially Odyssey. Please also support us to the extent that you can via PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. And please remember that we accept payments and donations in all currencies, including the new electronic ones. And please also remember to check out our Discord server and come to our shop and look up the wonderful things you will find there. Our famous magic mugs, our hats, our t-shirts, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, and all the rest. And have a wonderful day. And please remember also to check your subscription to this channel.